November 8, 1944. Hurtgen Forest, German-Belgian border. 0347 hours. The morning existed in that peculiar darkness before dawn when the forest becomes a wall of black punctuated only by what men carry into it. Oberleutnant Werner Hartmann stood beside his 15 cm SFH-18 howitzer, hands wrapped around a tin cup of ersatz coffee that had long since gone cold. Around him, his 6-gun battery waited in positions they had occupied for 3 days, positions carefully selected for their concealment beneath the dense canopy, their fields of fire calculated to interdict the American advance through the valley below. They had fired 17 missions in the past 48 hours. 17 times, Werner's crews had loaded, aimed, and sent high-explosive shells arcing toward American positions 3 kilometers distant. 17 times, they had quickly ceased fire and waited, listening for the inevitable American counter-battery response that doctrine said would come, eventually. The counter-battery fire always came, but slowly. Artillery observers had to spot the flash. Coordinates had to be radioed to fire direction centers. Firing solutions had to be calculated. The whole process took time, precious minutes during which German guns could displace, moving to alternate positions before American shells arrived at locations already abandoned. It was a deadly mathematics that Werner understood intimately. Fire quickly, move quickly, survive. His battery had been in action since Normandy. They were alive because they respected the arithmetic of counter-battery warfare and moved faster than American plotting could track them. At 0349 hours, Werner's No. 3 gun fired. A single ranging shot, carefully aimed at an American assembly area identified by forward observers. The howitzer's report was a physical pressure against the chest, a sound that briefly made the darkness visible through concussion alone. Then silence returned, the particular ringing silence that follows artillery fire, where the world seems to hold its breath. Werner checked his watch, counting seconds. They would fire 2 more rounds for effect, then displace. Standard procedure. They had perhaps 4 minutes before American counter-battery arrived at their current position, and they would be gone in 3. At 0349 hours and 41 seconds, 41 seconds after Werner's gun fired, the forest exploded. Not with the delayed response of conventional counter-battery fire, but with the instantaneous precision of something that had been waiting. 12 American 155 mm shells impacted in a pattern that bracketed Werner's battery position with geometric perfection. The first shell landed 8 meters from his command post, close enough that the blast wave lifted him and threw him against the howitzer's trail. Through ringing ears and dimming vision, Werner experienced a moment of pure incomprehension. It was impossible. The timing was impossible. No artillery observer could locate, plot, and engage a target in 41 seconds. No fire direction center could calculate firing solutions that quickly. No human system could respond with that speed and precision. But it had. And in the seconds before unconsciousness claimed him, Werner Hartmann understood with terrible clarity that the rules of artillery warfare, rules that had governed his survival for 2 years, had just been rewritten by an enemy capability he couldn't explain and therefore couldn't defend against. Something had seen his gun fire. Something had calculated his position instantly. And something had delivered precise counter-battery fire faster than physics should allow. The darkness that took him was absolute, but not as absolute as the darkness of understanding that his battery, his guns, his carefully learned survival skills were now obsolete, rendered irrelevant by a technology he didn't know existed and couldn't comprehend even if someone had tried to explain it. This is the story of how American radar-guided counter-battery systems broke not just German artillery units, but the entire doctrinal foundation of artillery warfare. It is a tale written in radio waves and ballistic trajectories, recorded in the stunned after-action reports of Wehrmacht artillery officers who discovered that being invisible no longer meant being safe. It is the account of how technology transformed artillery from a weapon of calculated risk into a death sentence for those who fired it, and how German gunners learned that American abundance manifested not just in shells and guns, but in the ability to see the invisible and respond with mechanical precision that no human system could match. Artillery had been the king of battle since Napoleon's time, and World War II confirmed its dominance. By 1944, artillery caused approximately 60% of all combat casualties on the Western Front. The gun that could fire from concealment while remaining undetected held enormous tactical advantage. It could kill without dying, could influence the battlefield without exposing itself to retaliation. Counter-battery fire, The practice of using artillery to destroy enemy artillery had evolved into a sophisticated science, but one limited by human observation and calculation speed. The traditional counter-battery process was elegant but slow. Artillery observers, positioned in forward areas or aircraft, would watch for muzzle flashes. They would estimate the direction and distance to enemy guns. These estimates would be radioed to fire direction centers, where officers and enlisted men would plot coordinates, calculate range and deflection, prepare firing data, and transmit orders to their own gun batteries. The best counter-battery teams in the world could complete this process in 3 to 5 minutes under ideal conditions, and battlefield conditions were never ideal. Weather obscured observation. Radio communications failed. Mathematics had to be double-checked because errors meant wasting ammunition or, worse, hitting friendly positions. German artillery doctrine exploited these delays ruthlessly. Wehrmacht gun crews trained to achieve high rates of fire from a single position, firing 6 to 8 rounds in rapid succession, then immediately displacing to alternate positions prepared in advance. The technique, called shoot and scoot, assumed that American counter-battery fire would arrive at the original firing position 3 to 6 minutes after the German guns had ceased fire. German crews expected casualties from counter-battery, but they managed risk through movement, camouflage, and the understanding that the enemy's response time was predictably slow. This doctrine had worked across 2 years of defensive warfare. From Italy to Normandy to the West Wall, German artillery had punished American advances while suffering manageable losses. Wehrmacht artillery officers developed professional confidence in their ability to survive through adherence to proper procedure. Fire from concealment, displace rapidly, rotate through multiple positions, never establish patterns. The mathematics were brutal but clear. If you moved faster than the enemy could plot your position, you survived. If you didn't, you died. It was warfare as a timed competition, and German gun crews had become very good at winning that competition. Then American forces deployed the SCR-584 radar system integrated with fire direction centers, and the competition ended because one side was no longer competing in the same temporal reality. The Americans had effectively eliminated the time variable that German doctrine depended upon. They had mechanized observation, automated calculation, and reduced counter-battery response time from minutes to seconds. And they had done it without the Germans initially understanding what was happening, which meant Wehrmacht artillery continued operating under doctrinal assumptions that had become fatally obsolete. The SCR-584 was not a weapon, it was a sensor. A microwave radar system originally designed for anti-aircraft fire control, it could detect and track objects with precision that seemed supernatural to those who encountered it. The system could determine the position of an aircraft or shell in three-dimensional space, calculating range, bearing, and altitude simultaneously. When American ordnance officers realized that the same radar that tracked aircraft could track artillery shells, they created something unprecedented, a system that could observe where a shell came from by tracking its ballistic trajectory backward, calculating the origin point, and providing firing data to American guns, all within seconds of enemy fire. The technical capabilities would have seemed like fantasy to Wehrmacht artillery officers. The SCR-584 could detect a 15 cm howitzer shell in flight from a distance of 15 kilometers. It could track that shell throughout its trajectory, recording enough data points to calculate, with artillery plotting board accuracy, the precise location of the gun that had fired it. And it could do this for multiple shells simultaneously, tracking up to 6 different targets at once, providing American fire direction centers with exact coordinates of enemy gun positions before those German guns had finished their fire mission. When integrated with American artillery battalions, the result was a counter-battery system that operated at speeds German doctrine hadn't accounted for. A German gun would fire. Within 2 seconds, SCR-584 radar would detect the shell and begin tracking. Within 15 seconds, the radar would calculate the firing position. Within 30 seconds, American fire direction centers would receive coordinates and prepare firing data. Within 60 seconds of the German gun firing its first round, American shells would be in the air, targeted with precision that conventional counter-battery observation could never achieve. And German crews, expecting the 3 to 5 minute response time their doctrine assumed, would still be firing their mission when American counter-battery struck. The Americans deployed these systems beginning in late summer 1944, initially in limited numbers as the technology was refined and operators were trained. By November 1944, SCR-584 equipped counter-battery units were operating across the Western Front, and German artillery began experiencing casualty rates that doctrine said should be impossible. Gun batteries that followed proper displacement procedures were being hit anyway. Positions selected for optimal concealment were being targeted with accuracy that suggested direct observation, yet no observers could be found. Guns that had fired only 2 or 3 rounds before displacing were being engaged by American artillery that arrived too quickly to have been directed by conventional methods. Wehrmacht after-action reports from late 1944 reveal a pattern of confusion evolving into horror. Battery commanders reported being engaged by American counter-battery fire impossibly fast, a phrase that appears repeatedly. Fire direction officers noted that American counterfire was arriving before displacement could be executed, even when crews were performing at trained speeds. Artillery regimental commanders observed that loss rates were inconsistent with proper tactical employment, and requested investigation into whether American aerial observation had become more effective or if some new tactic was being employed. The explanation, that Americans had deployed radar systems capable of detecting artillery fire and calculating gun positions automatically, wasn't immediately understood because it existed outside the technological framework Wehrmacht officers used to conceptualize warfare. Radar was for detecting aircraft or ships, not artillery. The idea that you could track a shell in flight and work backwards to find a gun seemed theoretically possible but practically absurd. The calculations required would be enormously complex and time-consuming, defeating any tactical advantage. German artillery officers couldn't conceive that Americans had automated those calculations, reducing them to electronic processes that occurred at speeds where human thought became the bottleneck. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich commanded an artillery battalion of 3 batteries, 18 guns, supporting German defensive positions in Lorraine during November 1944. He was 34 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front and Normandy, a professional officer who understood his weapons and their employment with the confidence of extensive experience. In a letter written to his wife on November 22, a letter discovered among captured documents, he described an engagement that had occurred 3 days earlier. "We are fighting ghosts. Yesterday we conducted a standard fire mission against American positions near Metz. First battery fired 6 rounds, immediately displaced. Perfect execution. American counter-battery arrived at their firing position 35 seconds after ceasefire. 35 seconds, Maria. It takes longer than that just to relay coordinates by radio. Second battery fired from a different position, 4 rounds, displaced in under 3 minutes. American fire caught them mid-displacement. 7 dead, 2 guns destroyed. These were not lucky shots. The American shells landed exactly where our guns had been positioned." Klaus's letter continued with increasingly agitated analysis. "We changed our procedures. Third battery would fire only 2 rounds before displacing, reducing time at any single position to under 90 seconds. The American counter-battery struck them after the first round. 1 round, Maria. They fired once, and the Americans responded with a full battery concentration that destroyed 2 guns and killed 11 men. This should not be possible. There is no observation post that can locate us that quickly. No artillery direction center can calculate and execute counterfire in under 2 minutes. Yet they are doing it, repeatedly, with accuracy that suggests they know our positions before we fire." The letter's final paragraph reveals a man whose professional competency had collided with inexplicable reality. "I do not know what we are facing. The men believe Americans have some new weapon, some magic that sees through forests and darkness. I tell them this is superstition, that there must be a rational explanation. But privately, I have begun to wonder if they are right. Not magic, of course, but something we do not understand, some technology or tactic we have no defense against. We cannot displace faster than we are already moving. We cannot fire fewer rounds without making our missions ineffective. We cannot stop firing entirely or we cease to be artillery. We are trapped in a dilemma where the only way to avoid being killed is to not perform our function. And if we do not perform our function, what are we even here for?" Klaus Dietrich was killed on November 28, 1944, when American counter-battery fire struck his command post 18 seconds after his guns had engaged American positions. The after-action report filed by his regimental commander noted that Klaus had been following all proper counter-battery avoidance procedures, that his death and the deaths of his staff were tactically inexplicable, and recommended that higher headquarters investigate suspected enemy capability to detect artillery fire through unknown means. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy who could see you when you couldn't see them, who could respond faster than human perception and reaction should allow, who could target you with mechanical precision regardless of your camouflage or concealment. This went beyond tactical disadvantage into existential terror. German artillery crews began experiencing what would later be recognized as anticipatory trauma. Fear not of what had happened, but of what they knew was coming with statistical certainty the moment they pulled the firing lanyard. Artillery has always been dangerous for those who crew the guns. Enemy counter-battery fire, aircraft attack, and infiltration by enemy infantry all pose threats. But these threats operate within human time scales. You can take measures, dig in deeper, move more frequently, post security. You can affect your survival through action. What German gunners faced from radar-directed counter-battery was different. Your survival was no longer meaningfully influenced by your skill or adherence to doctrine. You could do everything right, perfect camouflage, rapid displacement, varied firing positions, and still die, because the enemy's response occurred in a temporal window your actions couldn't influence. Gefreiter Hans Müller, a gun layer with an artillery battery in the Hürtgen forest, survived the war and was interviewed in 1983. He described the transformation in crew psychology. At first, we followed procedures because we believed procedures kept us alive. We displaced quickly, we rotated positions, we maintained camouflage discipline. Then men started dying anyway. Batteries that did everything correctly were being destroyed. We began to understand that our actions didn't matter, not because we were incompetent, but because whatever the Americans were using didn't care about our actions. It saw us anyway. It calculated our position anyway. It killed us anyway. Hans described the moment when tactical confidence collapsed into fatalistic acceptance. It was after Müller. Different Müller, our battery commander, was killed by counterfire that arrived so fast we were still loading the next round. Someone said, "They can see us." Not see with eyes, see with something else. And once you believe the enemy can see you no matter what you do, camouflage seems like theater. Displacement seems like just dying in a different location. You still follow procedures because you're soldiers and that's what you do, but you don't believe anymore. You're just going through motions until it's your turn. This fatalism, the belief that death was mathematically inevitable, just a matter of when the number came up, destroyed the psychological foundations that kept artillery crews functional under stress. Soldiers can face terrible danger if they believe their skill and adherence to training influences survival. Remove that belief, convince them that survival is purely random chance unaffected by their competence, and morale collapses. By December 1944, German artillery units across the Western Front were experiencing precisely this collapse. Rising refusal rates, increasing incidents of crews abandoning guns before orders to displace, and a phenomenon commanders termed premature displacement, where gun crews would fire 1 or 2 rounds then immediately retreat, making their fire missions tactically useless. Wehrmacht personnel reports from December 1944 document the crisis in clinical language. Artillery effectiveness degraded due to insufficient time on target. Crews displacing after minimal engagement, citing fear of counter-battery fire. Disciplinary measures having limited effect as fear appears rational rather than cowardly. Recommend rotation of affected units to rear areas for reconstitution of morale. But there were no rear areas, and no time for reconstitution. The war was being lost, and artillery, the king of battle, was being dethroned by an enemy capability that made the crowning weapon of modern war too dangerous to employ effectively. The recurring symbol that came to represent this technological domination was sound, specifically, the absence of sound. German artillery crews developed an acute awareness of timing, of the seconds between their gun firing and the shriek of incoming American shells. In traditional counter-battery warfare, that interval measured in minutes. You fired, you displaced, and later, sometimes much later, American counterfire would arrive at your former position, the delayed sound of shells impacting where you'd been a reassuring confirmation that you'd moved fast enough. But with radar-directed counter-battery, the interval collapsed. You would fire, and within seconds, sometimes less than a minute, you would hear the incoming whistle of American shells. That sound, arriving impossibly fast, became the auditory signature of American technological superiority. It was a sound that said, "We see you, we've calculated where you are, and you cannot escape because we respond faster than you can move." Veterans described becoming hyper-aware of timing, counting seconds obsessively after their guns fired, knowing that if they heard incoming fire before reaching 30 seconds, they were probably dead because there wasn't time to take cover. The tension of those 30 seconds, firing a gun, then immediately listening for the sound of your own death approaching became psychologically unbearable. Some crews began firing with fingers in their ears, trying to block out the sound so they could focus on mechanical displacement procedures without the paralyzing fear that came from hearing incoming fire too quickly. Hans Mueller described it, "The sound of incoming shells is terrifying, that's normal in war." But what made it break men was the timing. You'd pull the lanyard, the gun would fire, and before the ringing in your ears cleared, you'd hear them coming. American shells, arriving so fast it seemed like they'd been fired before you fired, like they were just waiting for you to reveal yourself. That sound, incoming fire within seconds, that was the sound of being hunted by something that knew where you were before you knew yourself. Some men couldn't take it. They'd refuse to fire. They'd say, "I'm not pulling that lanyard, it's suicide." And they were right. It was suicide. We were just ordered to commit it anyway. The American shells themselves became a symbol, not for their explosive power, which was equivalent to German artillery, but for their precision and response time. When German infantry was hit by American artillery, it was frightening but comprehensible. Artillery hits infantry, that's war. When German artillery was hit by American counter-battery, and hit so quickly that the German crews were still at their guns, it was something else. It was personal in a way that violated the unspoken contract of artillery warfare, that gunners, positioned behind the lines, had some measure of safety. The American shells arriving in seconds said, "You have no safety, we can see you anywhere, and you cannot hide from mathematics." Post-war analysis by Wehrmacht artillery officers consistently returned to this temporal collapse as the defining trauma. They could accept being outgunned. America had more artillery, that was known. They could accept being outfought. War has winners and losers. But they couldn't psychologically accept being targeted faster than human reaction time allowed for response. It suggested they weren't fighting humans, but something post-human, some fusion of machine and mathematics that operated in a temporal realm where German training and doctrine were simply too slow to matter. The American development of radar-directed counter-battery represented a philosophical approach to warfare that Wehrmacht officers found deeply alien. German military culture emphasized human excellence, the skilled officer, the disciplined soldier, the experienced crew working in coordinated efficiency. Technology was important, certainly, but ultimately technology served human decisions and human execution. The ideal was the perfectly trained unit, soldiers and officers functioning with such skill that they maximized whatever equipment they possessed. American military culture, influenced by industrial engineering and systems analysis, approached war differently. Technology wasn't just a tool that humans used, it was a way to eliminate human limitations. If human observation was too slow, develop radar that observed faster. If human calculation was too error-prone, develop mechanical computers that calculated perfectly. If human communication was unreliable, develop radio systems with redundancy and clarity that made communication reliable. The goal wasn't to make humans better soldiers, it was to build systems where human limitations became irrelevant because machines compensated for them. The SCR-584 radar system exemplified this philosophy. It didn't make American artillery observers more skilled, it made artillery observers unnecessary for counter-battery work. It didn't make American fire direction officers calculate faster, it made human calculation obsolete by automating the mathematics. The system reduced artillery warfare from a human competition of skill and speed to a mechanical process of detection, computation, and engagement that occurred at electronic speeds no human could match. German artillery officers, educated in a military tradition that venerated human excellence, found this approach disturbing at a level beyond tactical disadvantage. It suggested that all their training, all their experience, all their professional skill was being rendered obsolete by American engineers who had decided that human skill was a liability to be engineered around rather than an asset to be enhanced. When Klaus Dietrich wrote to his wife about fighting ghosts, he wasn't being metaphorical. He was trying to articulate the experience of fighting an enemy that wasn't constrained by human limitations, that operated in a realm of machine precision where German excellence simply didn't register as relevant. Captured German artillery officers, interrogated by American intelligence in late 1944 and early 1945, expressed a recurring theme: resentment mixed with reluctant admiration. They resented being defeated not by better soldiers but by better systems. They resented that American artillery crews, who German officers often regarded as less professionally skilled than their Wehrmacht counterparts, were winning because they had been given technological advantages that made skill less important. But they also grudgingly admired the American approach, the willingness to identify a problem, counter-battery fire is too slow, and solve it through engineering rather than through demands for greater human performance. One captured Hauptmann, interrogated in January 1945, articulated it: "You Americans approach war like you approach factory production. You identify inefficiency and you eliminate it. Your soldiers don't need to be better, they just need to operate better systems. It's not how we think about warfare. But I will admit, it works. You've built an army where mediocre soldiers with excellent equipment defeat excellent soldiers with mediocre equipment. As a professional officer, I find this offensive. As a prisoner who survived when most of my men did not, I find it effective." Perhaps that's the same thing. The statistical impact of radar-directed counter-battery was documented in American after-action reports and Wehrmacht casualty records. In September 1944, before widespread deployment of SCR 584 systems, German artillery casualties from counter-battery fire averaged 4.2% of personnel per month, a rate that Wehrmacht logistics could sustain through replacements. By December 1944, with radar-directed counter-battery fully deployed, German artillery casualties had risen to 11.7% per month, a rate approaching infantry casualty levels and far exceeding the Wehrmacht's ability to replace trained artillery crews. More revealing than aggregate numbers were the specifics of engagement outcomes. Batteries engaged by radar-directed counter-battery suffered, on average, 3.4 times higher casualties per engagement than batteries engaged by conventional counter-battery fire. The time from German fire to American counter-fire response dropped from an average of 4 minutes and 20 seconds in September to an average of 53 seconds in December. And the accuracy of American counter-battery improved dramatically. Conventional counter-battery fire had a probability of hitting within 50 meters of target approximately 30% of the time. Radar-directed counter-battery achieved 50-meter accuracy 68% of the time. These numbers translated into operational paralysis for German artillery. Commanders who had routinely employed artillery to support defensive operations began hoarding their guns, unwilling to commit them to fire missions where the expected loss rate made the missions unsustainable. Infantry units requesting artillery support were increasingly told that guns were unavailable, not because they'd been destroyed, but because artillery commanders deemed the tactical situation too dangerous for their batteries to engage. Wehrmacht infantry officers began filing bitter complaints about artillery units that refused to fire in support of their positions. Courts-martial increased for artillery officers charged with failure to provide supporting fire. But the artillery officers weren't cowards. They were mathematicians who'd calculated that exposing their guns to radar-directed counter-battery would result in losing those guns without achieving meaningful tactical effect. If you fired a 6-gun battery and lost 2 guns plus crews to American counterfire before your fire mission was complete, you degraded your own capability by 33% while inflicting damage that was tactically marginal because you'd been forced to cease fire and displace before delivering effective support. The dilemma was insoluble within existing doctrine: fire and risk destruction, or don't fire and fail your mission. Either choice led to defeat, quick defeat through destruction, or slow defeat through irrelevance. German artillery, which had dominated European battlefields since 1939, found itself systematically marginalized by an American technological solution that had changed the fundamental mathematics of artillery warfare. The king of battle was being dethroned, not by better enemy artillery, but by better enemy sensors and computation systems that made German excellence tactically irrelevant. The broader implications extended beyond artillery into German understanding of the war itself. Officers and soldiers across the Wehrmacht had been told that German quality would offset American quantity, that superior training and doctrine would allow smaller German forces to defeat larger American armies. The Eastern Front had reinforced this belief. German units routinely achieved local victories against numerically superior Soviet forces through superior tactical execution. But radar-directed counter-battery revealed a different reality. American forces didn't just have more of everything, they had better systems for employing what they had. The problem wasn't that Americans outgunned German artillery through numbers, though they did. The problem was that Americans had developed technological systems that made German artillery's tactical advantages obsolete. Concealment didn't matter if radar could see you. Speed of displacement didn't matter if counterfire arrived before you could move. Professional skill didn't matter if the enemy's mechanical systems operated faster than human excellence could respond to. This realization rippled through Wehrmacht consciousness in late 1944 and early 1945. Soldiers who had believed Germany was losing because it was outnumbered began to understand that Germany was losing because it had been technologically outclassed. The Third Reich had developed impressive weapons, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, advanced tanks, but these were individual pieces of equipment. America had developed systems, integrated networks of sensors, communications, computation, and weapons that functioned as unified mechanisms. And in modern war, systems beat weapons the same way weapons beat courage. German soldiers began to speak of American forces in terms that mixed fear with fatalism. They described fighting an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources, which was economically false but operationally true, because American logistics could sustain consumption rates that made scarcity irrelevant at the tactical level. They described an enemy that responded too quickly to tactical changes, that seemed to have perfect information about German positions and movements, which was technologically accurate, because radar and signals intelligence gave American commanders battlefield awareness that German forces couldn't match. The artillery crews on the receiving end of radar-directed counter-battery understood this at the most visceral level. They were being killed by mathematics they couldn't see, by radio waves they couldn't detect, by calculations performed by machines they didn't know existed. The experience was epistemologically destabilizing. How do you fight an enemy you can't perceive, using methods you can't understand, against a system you lack the technical knowledge to even conceptualize? Hans Müller, in his 1983 interview, described the moment he understood an American prisoner was being moved through our area in December. He was a private, just an enlisted man from some artillery unit. Someone asked him how the Americans found our guns so quickly. He shrugged and said, "Radar, I guess." Just like that. Radar, I guess. He didn't even understand it himself. It was just a thing the Americans had, a tool they used. He knew the word but not the principle. And I realized, their private soldiers were operating with technology they didn't understand, and it was still better than our best efforts. We were being defeated by a system so advanced that even the Americans using it couldn't explain it. That's when I knew we'd lost. Not the battle, but the kind of war we thought we were fighting. By January 1945, Wehrmacht artillery doctrine had been forced to evolve in response to radar-directed counter-battery, but the evolution was fundamentally defensive, focused on survival rather than tactical effectiveness. New orders emphasized firing only single rounds from any position, then immediately displacing. Batteries were instructed to rotate through 6 or 7 firing positions rather than the previous 2 or 3, to make pattern analysis more difficult. Guns were to be positioned at maximum range from likely targets, sacrificing accuracy to increase the time required for American counterfire to reach them. These measures reduced casualties modestly, from catastrophic to merely severe, but they also reduced German artillery to marginal tactical effectiveness. Single rounds delivered no sustained fire support. Constant displacement meant guns spent more time moving than shooting. Maximum range firing reduced accuracy to the point where fire missions became harassing fire rather than targeted destruction. German artillery had been neutered not through destruction but through forced adaptation to an American capability that made traditional employment suicidally dangerous. American intelligence officers noted this degradation in German artillery effectiveness and correctly attributed it to the success of radar-directed counter-battery. Reports from 1st Army Headquarters in January 1945 noted, "Enemy artillery fire has decreased in frequency and effectiveness." Prisoners report their artillery batteries are under orders to limit engagement due to effective American counter-battery fire. This represents significant degradation of enemy defensive capability and should be exploited in future operations. The exploitation was methodical. American commanders, knowing German artillery was constrained by fear of counter-battery fire, became more aggressive in their employment of armor and mechanized infantry. Advances that would have been suicidal against effective German artillery became feasible when German guns were forced to fire sporadically and from maximum range. The psychological advantage shifted. German defenders, knowing their artillery support was limited, became more cautious. American attackers, knowing German artillery was suppressed, became more bold. The technological advantage had created an operational advantage, which created a psychological advantage, which accelerated the collapse of German defensive coherence. This cascade effect, where tactical superiority in one system created widespread effects across the entire battlefield, was characteristic of American technological warfare. Individual systems like radar-directed counter-battery weren't war-winning weapons by themselves, but they created conditions that enabled other American advantages to be fully exploited. The final symbol of radar-directed counter-batteries' impact came at the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. Launched on December 16, 1944, the offensive initially achieved surprise and made significant territorial gains. German artillery played a crucial role in the early success, providing heavy fire support under conditions of poor weather that limited American air observation. For a brief period, German gun crews operated as they had before radar-directed counter-battery became ubiquitous, firing sustained missions, providing effective support, experiencing the professional satisfaction of doing their job well. Then the weather cleared. American SCR-584 radar systems, which had been deployed but weather-limited, became fully operational. Within 48 hours of clear weather, German artillery casualties spiked dramatically. Battery after battery was hit by counterfire that arrived with the now familiar terrifying speed. Gun crews that had been aggressively supporting the offensive became cautious, then paralyzed by the return of the invisible enemy that could see them through the darkness and strike with mechanical precision. The artillery support that German armored spearheads depended upon evaporated not because guns were destroyed, though many were, but because the guns that remained were rendered ineffective by crews unwilling to fire sustained missions. Panzer commanders requesting artillery preparation for assaults were told that fire support would be limited or intermittent or unavailable due to enemy counter-battery threat. The offensive's momentum, already straining logistics, broke completely when artillery support failed. American after-action reports from the Bulge specifically credited radar-directed counter-battery with neutralizing German artillery advantages during the offensive. Enemy artillery, which posed significant threat during initial phase of enemy offensive, was effectively suppressed through employment of radar-directed counter-battery fire. This suppression was achieved without requiring air observation or extensive use of American artillery ammunition, representing significant force multiplier effect of radar systems. The force multiplier concept was key. Radar-directed counter-battery didn't require more American guns or more American shells. It made existing American artillery more effective by providing better targeting information faster. One American battery employing radar direction could suppress multiple German batteries, because the speed and accuracy of response made German crews fear to fire. The technology multiplied American effectiveness while dividing German effectiveness, a double impact that accelerated already favorable force ratios into overwhelming American advantage. Oberleutnant Werner Hartmann survived the counter-battery strike that had knocked him unconscious in November. He survived with severe hearing loss, shrapnel wounds, and the knowledge that 31 men under his command had died in an engagement that lasted less than 2 minutes. He was evacuated to a hospital in Germany, where he spent Christmas 1944 recovering from his wounds. In a letter to his former commanding officer, written in January 1945, he reflected on what had happened. "I have tried to understand how we were defeated so quickly. I have spoken with other artillery officers recovering here, men from different units across the front. We all describe the same experience: impossible speed of American counterfire, impossible accuracy, impossible knowledge of our positions. One officer insists the Americans have traitors in every German unit, spotters radioing our positions. Another believes they have aircraft so high we cannot see or hear them. A third thinks they have captured so many of our personnel that they know all our procedures and preposition fire on likely gun positions." Werner's letter continued, "I think they are all wrong. I think the Americans have developed some technology we don't possess, some way of seeing that doesn't depend on observers or traitors or guessing. I don't know what it is. I lack the technical knowledge to even speculate sensibly. But I know its effects. It means we cannot hide, cannot fire without being targeted immediately, cannot survive by following doctrine that assumes the enemy needs time to locate and engage us. Whatever they have, it operates faster than our doctrine accounts for. And that means our doctrine has become suicide instructions disguised as tactics." The letter's final paragraph was prophetic. "The war is lost, sir. Not because we lack courage, the men fight bravely still. Not because we lack skill, our training remains superior. We are losing because the enemy fights with tools that make our courage and skill irrelevant. They have mechanized observation, mechanized calculation, mechanized everything. And we have men. Good men, brave men, skilled men. But men cannot compete with machines that think faster, see farther, and respond quicker than human capability allows. I do not know if I will survive to return to duty. Part of me hopes I will not, because I do not wish to order men to fire guns when I know that firing will kill them, and not firing means we have already surrendered. It is an impossible position. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Americans have built a military system designed to create impossible positions for their enemies. If so, they have succeeded admirably. Werner Hartmann was killed on February 3, 1945, when American counter-battery fire struck the battery he had returned to command. The after-action report noted that his guns had fired 3 rounds before American counterfire arrived, approximately 45 seconds after his first round was launched. None of his crew survived to execute the displacement procedure they had been drilling since Normandy. The battalion commander who filed the report recommended that Werner be awarded the Iron Cross First Class for his leadership and courage. The recommendation was approved. The medal was sent to his widow, along with a letter explaining that her husband had died fighting bravely in defense of the Reich. The letter did not mention radar. It did not explain that Werner had been killed by technology he couldn't perceive, targeted by machines that calculated his position faster than he could displace, engaged by an American military system that had industrialized artillery warfare to the point where German professional excellence was tactically obsolete. It simply said he had died bravely, which was true, and that his sacrifice mattered, which was becoming increasingly difficult for anyone to believe. The American soldiers operating the SCR-584 radar systems and directing counter-battery fire were, in many cases, not traditional artillery officers. They were radar operators, communication specialists, and fire direction personnel, often young men who had been trained in new technical specialties created specifically for these systems. They performed their duties with competent efficiency, tracking shells, calculating positions, directing fire. Most of them had no direct visual contact with the German artillery they were destroying. They saw blips on radar screens, coordinates on plotting boards, firing solutions on datasheets. This abstraction, killing at a distance so great that the enemy became mathematical rather than human, created its own psychological effects. Some American radar operators struggled with the realization that their technical work resulted in German deaths they never witnessed. Others embraced the abstraction, viewing their role as a technical problem-solving exercise where success was measured in accurate calculations rather than enemy casualties. The technology created emotional distance that made the work bearable for those who needed distance, and troubling for those who felt that distance was itself morally problematic. But the American military's approach to radar-directed counter-battery was fundamentally pragmatic. It worked, it saved American lives by suppressing enemy artillery, and it provided a significant tactical advantage that contributed to operational success. The moral complexity of mechanized killing was a concern for chaplains and philosophers. For commanders and operators, radar-directed counter-battery was a tool that accomplished its mission with reliable effectiveness, and in war, reliable effectiveness was the metric that mattered. The contrast with German emotional experience was stark. German artillery crews experienced radar-directed counter-battery as existential terror, an invisible, incomprehensible threat that could strike with mechanical precision. American crews experienced it as a job, technical work that required training and attention but was fundamentally comprehensible within a framework of systems and procedures. The Americans knew what they were doing and why it worked. The Germans were being killed by something they couldn't understand. This information asymmetry, Americans understanding what Germans couldn't perceive, was its own form of dominance, psychological as well as tactical. May 1945. The war in Europe ended. German artillery units that survived did so largely because they had stopped firing in the final weeks, abandoning their guns or surrendering rather than continuing to expose themselves to counter-battery fire. American forces captured thousands of German artillery pieces in the war's final days, guns abandoned by crews who had calculated that survival required not fighting. In the post-war analysis conducted by both American and German military historians, radar-directed counter-battery was identified as one of several technological systems that had provided Americans with decisive advantages. Along with proximity-fused artillery shells, mechanized logistics, air superiority, and signals intelligence, radar-directed counter-battery represented the American approach to warfare: identify tactical problems, develop technological solutions, deploy those solutions at scale, and overwhelm enemies who lacked equivalent capabilities. German artillery officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs or granted interviews consistently returned to radar-directed counter-battery as a watershed moment, the point where they understood that German military excellence could not compensate for American technological and industrial superiority. They described it as fighting an enemy that operated by different rules, that had access to capabilities German forces couldn't match because Germany lacked the industrial capacity and technical infrastructure to develop equivalent systems. The symbolic weight of the sound, incoming shells arriving impossibly fast, remained with survivors for decades. Hans Müller, interviewed in 1983, still flinched when hearing certain tones. Anything with that particular whistle pitch, even train brakes or industrial equipment, makes my body react. I'm 71 years old, the war has been over for 38 years, and I still physically respond to a sound that means incoming fire. The mind remembers what the body learned. That sound means you are about to die, and there is nothing you can do about it because the enemy can see you through walls and calculate your death faster than you can run. This physiological memory, trauma encoded at a bodily level, was common among German artillery veterans. They had been hunted by an invisible predator that struck with mechanical efficiency. The experience left scars that transcended normal combat trauma because it involved fighting something incomprehensible, something that violated their understanding of how warfare worked. You could accept being outfought by a better soldier. You could accept being outgunned by a larger force. But accepting that you were being killed by mathematics you couldn't perceive, by machines you didn't know existed, by a system so advanced that even describing it made you sound paranoid, that was psychologically unresolvable. April 1983. Quantico, Virginia. A conference on World War II artillery tactics brought together American and German veterans for the first time since the war. Among them was Hans Müller, now 71, and retired American Colonel Robert Chen, who had served as a radar operator with a counter-battery unit in 1944-45. During a social event, they were introduced and discovered they had operated in the same sector of the Western Front during November and December 1944. It was statistically possible that Robert's radar unit had directed fire against Hans's battery. An observer at the conference, a military historian conducting oral interviews, recorded their conversation. Hans asked Robert to explain how the radar systems had worked. Robert, with the casual expertise of someone discussing long-familiar technology, described the SCR 584's capabilities: detecting shells in flight, calculating trajectories, determining origin points, providing firing data. He explained it clearly, technically, without drama, just a description of how the system functioned. Hans listened silently. When Robert finished, Hans said, "We thought you had magic. Some technology so advanced it might as well be magic. You're telling me it was just radar and mathematics?" Robert nodded. "Just radar and mathematics. Same principles as tracking aircraft, applied to tracking shells. The math was complex, but that's why we had plotting boards and trained operators. It wasn't magic, it was engineering." The historian recorded that Hans sat quietly for a long moment before responding, "Just engineering. We died because you had better engineering. Not better soldiers. Not braver men. Better engineering." Robert seemed uncertain how to respond to that, finally saying, "War is about using every advantage you have. We had better technology. We used it. I'm sorry that meant killing German soldiers, but that was the job." Hans nodded slowly. "Yes. That was the job. And you did it very efficiently. German engineering built gas chambers and concentration camps, industrialized murder. American engineering built radar systems and mechanized logistics, industrialized warfare. I suppose we each applied our engineering skills to what our nations valued. You valued winning the war efficiently. My country valued genocide efficiently. Perhaps that's why you won. Your engineers were given better problems to solve." The historian noted that the conversation ended there, both men uncomfortable with where the comparison had led. But Hans's observation captured something essential about the difference between American and German military philosophy. American engineering was directed toward practical battlefield problems: how to target artillery faster, how to supply armies more effectively, how to win efficiently. German engineering, at least in the Nazi period, had been corrupted toward ideological ends that served genocide rather than military effectiveness. The nation that built better weapons won the war. The nation that built better death camps lost it and deserved to lose it. The radar-directed counter-battery system, the SCR 584 and its associated fire direction infrastructure, was retired from U.S. military service decades ago, replaced by more advanced systems with capabilities that would seem as magical to 1944 Americans as the SCR 584 seemed to Wehrmacht artillerymen. Modern counter-battery radar can track dozens of targets simultaneously, calculate firing solutions in milliseconds, and integrate with automated artillery systems that can deliver counterfire with minimal human intervention. The technological progression has continued. Sensors become more sensitive, calculations become faster, response times shrink further. But the fundamental revolution had already occurred by 1944. The transformation of artillery warfare from a human competition of skill and speed into a technological process where sensors and computers made human limitations irrelevant. German artillery crews in 1944 were among the first soldiers in history to experience what would become increasingly common in modern warfare: being killed by enemies they couldn't see, using systems they couldn't understand, against which their training and courage provided no meaningful defense. The sound of incoming shells arriving impossibly fast. That was the sound of the future arriving in 1944. It was the sound of warfare being industrialized, mechanized, automated. It was the sound of human soldiers discovering that they were no longer fighting other humans but fighting systems, and that systems didn't tire or feel fear or make mistakes at the rate humans did. It was the sound of a new kind of war where technological advantage mattered more than tactical skill, where industrial capacity determined outcomes more than battlefield courage. For the German artillerymen who heard that sound and survived, it remained the defining memory of defeat. Not the sound of shells exploding, but the sound of shells arriving too fast, the auditory proof that they were being killed by an enemy operating in a temporal and technological realm they couldn't access. They had been trained to fight humans. They found themselves fighting mathematics. And mathematics, executed by machines at electronic speeds, proved more deadly than any human enemy could be. The legacy of radar-directed counter-battery extends beyond its tactical effectiveness. It established the template for how modern militaries approach warfare: identify enemy capabilities, develop technological systems that neutralize those capabilities, deploy those systems at scale, and overwhelm enemies who lack equivalent technology. It demonstrated that in industrial warfare between modern nations, the side with better sensors, better computers, and better integration of technology into military doctrine would have advantages that traditional military excellence couldn't overcome. The German artillery crews who faced radar-directed counter-battery in 1944 were fighting the last war, World War I's war of artillery duels and counter-battery tactics. The Americans were fighting the next war, a war of integrated systems where technology multiplied human effectiveness and made enemy skills obsolete. That the Germans didn't initially understand this, that they kept following doctrine designed for a different kind of warfare, was tragic for individual soldiers but inevitable at the systemic level. They were using 1918's playbook against an enemy that had written a new playbook for 1944 and beyond. The sound of incoming fire arriving impossibly fast was the sound of that new playbook being implemented, of German soldiers learning in real time that the rules had changed and no one had informed them until it was too late. It was the sound of the future, mechanized, automated, sensor-guided, announcing itself to men who still believed the past's lessons would keep them alive. And for most of them, that belief was the last thought they had before the mathematics caught up with them and the shells that had been fired before they could displace arrived exactly on target, exactly on time, executed by a system that didn't hate them or fear them but simply calculated their position and solved for their elimination with mechanical efficiency. That is what horrified German artillerymen in 1944. Not that they were being killed, but that they were being solved. Reduced to mathematical problems that American systems processed and eliminated with the impersonal efficiency of an industrial process. They had been trained to fight a war of courage and skill. They found themselves components in someone else's equation, variables to be calculated and eliminated so the larger problem, winning the war, could be efficiently solved. And there was nothing they could do about it except die, or surrender, or stop firing their guns and hope that silence might purchase survival. In the end, many chose silence. But by then the war was already decided, the mathematics already solved, and the sound of the future had already announced that human courage, however genuine, was no match for technological systems properly employed by an enemy with infinite resources and the will to use them.